what rich people do is they use their money to determine what everything else happens in society, even if everyone else has enough to eat and adequate shelter, because they don't have equal power.
Daniel Markovits, welcome to How the Light Gets In.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So you're a professor at Yale Law School, one of the most elite educational institutions in the world. And yet a lot of your work recently has been critical about those very institutions and the people you educate. So have you felt a tension in critiquing the very system you excel in?
I mean, there's a tension of a certain sort, but I don't know that it's a different tension from anybody who has privilege critiquing the kind of privilege that they have. One of the things about this economic and social order that we've built is that it creates situations in which people who see through its structures have incentives and really only possibilities to act in ways that promote its structures. And this is maybe a particularly extreme version of that, and the tension is real, but I don't think it's only sort of particular or specific to someone in my circumstances.
So Yale Law School hasn't knocked on your door and said, can you turn that down a bit?
Oh, that's a separate question. No, it hasn't. But that's also a profound reflection of the system we're in, which is that the system is sufficiently stable at the moment, and its elite institutions are sufficiently self-confident that they're quite happy to have people inside them criticizing them, even very aggressively. Partly, I think, because they believe that at the end, the criticisms will not be effective.
So both in the UK and I think to a great extent in the US, people from both sides of the political spectrum say they believe in equality of opportunity. And a lot of them also equate that with meritocracy. They say, well, we need a system in which those who get rewarded in society are those who deserve to be rewarded based on their innate talents and their hard work. What's wrong with that picture?
So I think there are 2 points that are really important to make here. The first is that under meritocracy, advantage is distributed based on accomplishment. But there are 3 inputs to accomplishment: natural ability, effort, and training. And people who tend to champion meritocracy focus on natural ability and effort because they think, to my mind correctly, that natural abilities are more or less randomly distributed across the population, and even that differences in natural ability aren't debilitatingly great, and they think that anybody can put in effort. The thing they neglect is training, and training really works. And what's happened in our system is that the new elite, the elite that itself reached its position through meritocratic means, has an unmatched willingness and interest in training its children, and the enormous resources it gets through meritocratic pay enable it to invest in training its children in ways that nobody else can match, with the result that the children of rich parents are out-trained. And even though they don't have more natural ability and they don't have a greater propensity to put in effort, all the training that gets pushed into them is incredibly effective, and means that, for example, at an institution like mine, there are in typical recent years more children whose parents are in the top 1% of the income distribution than in the entire bottom half. And incidentally, this is not limited to elite educational institutions. There was a study a few years ago about Major League Baseball in the United States, and the share of Major League Baseball players whose parents are Major League Baseball players has been going up. And the reason is not natural ability. The reason is it takes an enormous amount of training to be able to hit, say, a major league curveball. And if your father knows how to do that and starts teaching you how to do that when you're 3 and can invest in coaches, by the time you're 18, you will know how to do that. And what that shows is that meritocracy and equality of opportunity are not the same thing. So that's the first very important point. The second very important point, which is briefer, is that when inequality of outcomes gets big enough, equality of opportunity becomes impossible. That's true under meritocracy because the elite outtrains everybody else, but it's true under every system. When outcomes are too different, those who have the most will use their privilege and power within the system or against the system, but often within the system, to secure opportunities for their children, and so equality of opportunity disappears.
Great. I'd like to ask you about that in a second, but should we stay on this idea of meritocracy? So a lot of people who critique our current socioeconomic arrangement argue that, well, meritocracy isn't working. We don't really have a meritocratic system. But you say, no, we do have a meritocratic system that's working, but that's unjust. What is it that the first group is missing? Do they miss this kind of crucial aspect of training that goes into meritocracy?
So I'm obviously, I have a dog in this fight. So people should discount what I say on account of the fact that I have a view. On the other hand, I've thought about it a lot. I mean, the disadvantage of thinking about something a lot is that you have a view. The advantage is that you've thought about it a lot. And that's a balance that people have to strike when they think about this. But the reason I began with this preface is that it's not part of my view that the elite aren't cheating. The elite are cheating. And so there is some degree of elite capture, of rent seeking, and just of outright fraud. And that's an important part of what's happening in the system. But my view is it is not the dominant explanation for the concentration of privilege at the top and the concentration of advantage in the children of rich parents. And, you know, one way to illustrate this is that in the United States, for example, if you are a big enough donor to a university, that affects your child's ability to get into that university, and it makes a difference. But the amount you have to donate is very, very large. $5, $10, $15 million. I don't know the exact amount because the universities, being ashamed of this, keep it secret. A very small number of kids get in that way. If your parents are alumni, that also helps you. But it's debatable how many kids get in on account of the alumni privilege or preference. And one reason that I know this is that my own law school has no alumni preference at all. And yet, our student body looks like the student body of other places, full of the children of privileged parents. The reason why is that the rich can secure an, in my mind, unjust advantage for their children within the system, rather than by violating the meritocratic rules. And to give you a sense of the force and power of this, here are two statistics about the United States that are striking. On the SAT test, which is the college admissions test, the gap between the typical SAT score of a child whose parents are in the top 5% of the income distribution and a middle-class child is now about 250 points. The gap between the typical SAT score of a middle-class child and a child that grows up below the poverty line is just 125 points. So the rich middle-class gap is twice as big as the middle-class poverty gap. And that's achieved not by cheating the system, but by playing within the system. An even more extreme version of this is that in a recent year, I looked at the numbers, there were roughly 15,000 high school seniors in the United States, one of whose parents had attended graduate or professional school, who scored at the Ivy League median on the SAT verbal score. If you ask how many kids in the country were there, neither of whose parents graduated high school, who scored at the Ivy League median, the answer is that the tail at that point is so thin that statistical techniques are unreliable. But if you crunch the numbers, it's under 100. And that is an enormous difference, obviously, in who gets into the Ivy League, and it doesn't require any cheating. Now, the fact that it doesn't require cheating, this is the last point I want to make, doesn't make it okay. And the other criticism I have of people on the left who focus on the abuse of the system is a criticism that people on the more radical left have always had of people on the more centrist left, which is they moralize and personalize politics. And it feels good to say that those who are at the top are somehow corrupt or venal. But if the real problem is structural, actually focusing on the corruption is a way that the system doesn't get challenged. Because it's relatively easy to say, let's get the rotten apples. Let's shut down the alumni preference. Let's stop people from being able to bribe their way into university and say we've won. And the fact is, even if all those things happened, the system would be, I don't know the precise number, 90%, 80%, as unequal as it is now. And structural change is hard. And that's what the system needs.
So you mentioned earlier that this meritocratic system has produced extreme inequalities of outcome. Do you think that's inevitable? Do you think a meritocratic system always leads to extreme inequalities of outcome? And then a couple sort of second question to that is, how do we make sense of the fact that, 40, 50 years ago, when perhaps we had even less of a meritocratic system, inequality of outcome was not as bad as it is today?
Yeah. So a couple things. If you look across historical experiences with meritocratic systems, and this isn't the first time this has happened, right? This happened in China long ago. And one of the things that happened with the Chinese meritocratic system is that the meritocrats started getting special training for their kids, who started acing the exams that got you into the elite positions in the next generation. And in a sense, this is like the iron law of oligarchy. It just applied to meritocracy. So I think, inevitable is a powerful word. There are tendencies in this direction, and it will be a constant struggle in a meritocratic system to temper the system in such a way that its virtues can be retained without succumbing to these vices, which I take to be really bad vices. On the question of inequality 50 years ago, it's very complicated because, in the United States, for example, there was enormously more racial inequality 50 years ago than there is today. There was enormously more gender inequality 50 years ago than there is today. There was enormously more religious inequality, enormous more equality by sexual orientation or gender identity than there is today. So there have been genuinely egalitarian and emancipatory movements that have succeeded, and succeeded, not completely, but impressively and highly consequentially. There was less economic inequality. And one of the reasons why was that 50 years ago was a moment when the meritocracy was getting going, and the old elite that the meritocracy displaced was structurally unsuited to succeeding at a meritocracy. To be blunt, the old elite weren't very smart, and they weren't very hardworking. And so when elite institutions of education and elite employers started demanding smarts and hard work, the old families just couldn't keep up. They weren't inclined to keep up, they couldn't keep up. And again, in a way, this goes back to the first part of your question. The old elite had become elite in a system that was different from the new system, and so they were unsuited to it. But the new elite had won at the new system, so they're suited to it. So there's a sense in which any system for creating an elite, as it gets older and older, will tend towards a more insular elite.
Mm. So some people, including John Rawls, famously, was a Harvard political philosopher, very influential in 20th century politics, argued that, well, a just society can tolerate quite a lot of inequality as long as it's making the worst off as well off as possible. And so some people have been pointing out, well, look, everyone's getting better off. Even the poor today are much better off than the poor were 50 years ago. So why worry about extreme inequality of outcome if that's the case, if everyone's being lifted at the same time?
Yeah. So a couple thoughts about this. The first is that Rawls himself was actually more clear-eyed and skeptical about inequality than some of his writings or that characterization of him acknowledges. I was at a conference years ago at which he spoke on the occasion of, I don't know if it was the 25th anniversary of the publication of A Theory of Justice. And he came very close to saying that economic inequality had made the government of the United States illegitimate. So Rawls himself saw some of this and was disturbed by it, although it didn't always come out in some of the writing. And Rawls was writing at a time when the problem wasn't quite what it is now. That doesn't, in some sense, what Rawls himself thought, who cares? I mean, I care because I admire the man, but why should anyone else care? But the underlying point is that economic inequality is deeply corrosive of a social order. And it's deeply corrosive because economic privilege is associated with political power. In a capitalist system, it just is political power. In the sense that in a capitalist system, money just is the power to commandeer the state in the service of your projects. So what it is to have 100 pounds is to be able to allocate resources in whatever way you wish up to the value of 100 pounds. And if somebody else tries to shift that allocation, somebody else tries to take the sweater you buy or block your entrance into the railway carriage for the ticket that you've bought, men with guns will come and put them in prison. And so what rich people do is they use their money to determine what everything else happens in society. And that is bad for everyone else, even if everyone else has enough to eat and adequate shelter, because they don't have equal power. And that then plays itself out in more overtly political ways to who controls candidates for office, whose lobbying is influential. So that matters a lot. But the other way in which it matters, and this is something actually that Rawls was very sensitive to, very few people read the third part of A Theory of Justice, which is on the moral and political psychology of social stability and a just order. And Rawls there talks about the fact that the political arrangements need to be such that they produce sympathies and bonds among the citizens intergenerationally in such a way that all citizens can come to see the collective arrangement as a shared project in the common interest. And at some point, inequality begins to undermine that, even if the worst off are not materially destitute.
To ask you a question about the sort of moral psychology of this problem. So sometimes this meritocracy problem is presented as a social status problem, right? And it's presented as such because meritocracy comes with this moral ideology that those who win deserve to win, those who lose deserve to lose. It was up to them. What if we just focused our attention in dismantling the ideological package of meritocracy so that people didn't feel that and they acknowledged that, well, I might be successful, but I'm successful because of structural reasons or because, my social circumstances, and vice versa with those at the other ends?
I think the way you formulated that point, which is a powerful point, elides two concepts. And desert can mean two different things. On the one hand, it can mean those who win are virtuous in a way that makes them responsibly entitled for their success. And those who lose are vicious in a way that makes them responsibly entitled for their failure. And the systems and structures that we've been describing, which show that so much of a person's outcomes depend on inputs that they couldn't possibly be responsible for. How much their parents have invested in their education, how much the state has invested in their education, undermines that conception of desert. Although notice that even there, meritocracy is insidious because it's a feature of meritocracy, unlike aristocracy, that the elite also has to have their own skin in the game. So even the rich kid who got all these inputs is still working all the time and is still displaying character traits that are virtuous all the time. And that makes it a little hard to disentangle this, but let's suppose we can. There's a second idea of desert, which goes to the question, well, how much are you worth? Not do you deserve to be as much as you're worth, but how much are you worth? And in a meritocracy, particularly a market meritocracy, you are worth the market price of your labor. You're worth your wage. And your wage is a marker not just of your ability to consume and your economic power, but also of your social esteem in the eyes of everyone else. And those who are worth a lot, even if they don't think they deserve to be worth a lot, are still in the public eye worth a lot. And those who are not worth a lot are declared worthless. The English have a phrase for this that the Americans don't pick up. When you get fired, you are made redundant. Right? And to be redundant is not a dignified state. It's to be surplus to requirements or worthless. And that's true not just in economic life. Think about the social economy of beauty in our society today. Nobody thinks that somebody who's exceptionally beautiful deserves it in the moral sense. They happen to be born exceptionally beautiful. On the other hand,
We still admire them.
they're admired and valued and popular and social. And those who are not beautiful, it's even a little awkward to say the word ugly. Why? Well, because it's a term of disgust and disapprobation. And it's not anybody's choice, but it's not, right? And so the only way to cure that is to stop making so much turn on how you look. It's not to have some high-minded view about who deserves what. You got to go to the root of the problem, which is the way you look is not a particularly important or valuable thing. And actually, by the way, also your market wage is not a particularly important or valuable thing, or would not be in a just society.
So there might be those who listen to your arguments and say, yeah, I hear all that, but what's the alternative? You know, meritocracy in people's minds might have come to replace something that was an even more stratified structure. We talked about the fact that 50 years ago, there were a lot more equalities based on race, gender. I would say to some extent also social class, right? I mean, back in the day, you went to Harvard or Yale probably because of social connections rather than your grades.
Well, actually now I think Harvard and Yale are more socioeconomically segregated than they were in 1970. Oxford and Cambridge are not, but Harvard and Yale are. But I get the point you're making.
Yeah, so the question is basically, is meritocracy just the best of bad options that we have?
A maths professor of mine used to say, to reject one extreme isn't to endorse its opposite. All right? And the old, roughly speaking, aristocratic system, and it could have been an aristocracy of class, family-based, or it could have been a race aristocracy, or it could have been a gender aristocracy. But the basic point is that there is some biologically passed on identity category that is, of course, also socially constructed, but that is passed mechanically to you at birth that determines your advantage, right? That's a terrible system. And there's no sane person would want to return to that. So what is an alternative? Well, it's helpful here to distinguish between superiority and excellence. So meritocracy emphasizes superiority, and that has two features. The first is that superiority is a positional value. If I am better than you, you are no longer superior, no matter how good you are. Right? So this is almost a winner takes all kind of a system, which is a little bit like the system that we have, unsurprisingly. Second of all, superiority is a formal property. I can be superior to you at anything, even if the thing that I do isn't actually very valuable. Modern finance, I think the best view, even among fairly conventional economists now, is that the social product of modern finance is zero. There's a kind of finance that's very valuable, because what you want to do is you want to get capital, financial capital, into the real projects in life that are most socially productive. And that's what finance properly constructed does. But modern finance is all about arbitrage. It's all about elaborate ways to squeeze out short-term advantages from the system. That's socially worthless, but there are people who are superior at it. And in our system, the people who are superior at it make literally $1 billion a year. Okay, now let's think about excellence. Excellence is different from superiority in both respects. Excellence is a threshold concept, not a positional concept. To be excellent at something is to be good enough at it to make it worth doing. And that formulation also shows that excellence is substantive. And excellence has to be at a task or project that's valuable. You can't be an excellent torturer, but you can be a superior torturer. And so an economic and social system that values and rewards excellence is not an aristocracy. It allocates jobs to people who are good enough at them to make them worth doing. But it doesn't mean that you have to be superior. And what does this mean very, very concretely? So let's take healthcare, for example. Right now, we have a system, particularly in the United States, that is incredibly competitive, focuses on superiority. It wants to know who is the most skilled vascular surgeon. And that person gets the healthcare system arranged around them and makes millions of dollars a year. We don't have enough nurses. We don't have enough GPs. You guys also don't have enough nurses or GPs, right? And nurses and GPs have two interesting properties. The first is, if we had more nurses and GPs, we would have a healthier population. If we redirected healthcare away from the superior, superordinate, elite-trained workers towards mid-skilled workers, population health would go up, because that's a much more efficient way to provide healthcare. Prevent diseases from coming up before they need to be cured by superior workers. And the second thing about nurses and GPs is that they're middle-class people. Middle class in the US American sense, not in the UK elitist sense. And so this system would provide better healthcare for the population and a much more egalitarian labor market. We don't have enough home health aides. We don't have enough teachers. We don't have enough of lots of tasks that would be middle-class, mid-skilled tasks. And people, if they were trained to be excellent at them, could do them without worrying whether they're a little better than somebody else. And that's the sort of economic arrangement that we should be aiming for.
Your next work looks at another sort of sacred cow, perhaps, of liberal democracy, growth, the ideology of growth. All governments aim for it. We think it's a way of alleviating poverty and at the same time encouraging social mobility. And yet there is this idea that it can't go on forever. What's your work on criticizing growth?
Yes, so the book is tentatively entitled The Good Life After the Age of Growth. And what that picks up on is, as you say, growth has become our common sense. We have associated growth both as societies and as individual people. We want more money. We want to manage bigger organizations. We've associated growth not just with one virtue, but with ambition in itself. And we have this feeling that if we give up on growth, we're just giving up, right? There are critics of growth, but those critics, to my mind, often frustratingly romanticize the pre-growth world and think that growth has always been a calamity. And my view, and the view of the book, is that growth and the ideal behind it are one of humanity's greatest moral accomplishments. 250 years ago, almost everybody was poor. 80% of the world in 1800 lived on less than $2 a day. That's what's considered deep poverty. Now, $2 a day in current dollars, not in $1800. And the reason why today only 10% of the world live on less than $2 a day, which is immorally too much, but very different from 80%, is growth. All right? The economic inequality in the world today is exactly the same as it was in 1800. So there's been no redistribution. It's all growth. So my view is growth is an enormous moral accomplishment. And it was accomplished partly because society embraced the growth ideal. At the same time, growth cannot continue. Over the last 250 years, the population of the world has increased by a factor of 10, and average incomes have increased by a factor of 30. If growth at that rate continues, in 2500, there will be 100 billion people on the planet who are, on average, 30 times as rich as the average Pole is today. That's not going to happen. So that means growth is going to end. And if growth is a moral ideal and growth is going to end, in the post-growth world, there'll be an enormous imaginative hole in our civilization. And we'll need to build a new civilization around new ideals that are suited for a world in which there's been a lot of growth, but there's not going to be any more. And the third part of the book describes what those ideals might look like.
Well, I look forward to that. Daniel Markovits, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.